Hello, everyone, and welcome to another one of our virtual conversations at Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. My name is Sheda Dayoni, and I am a postdoctoral research associate at the center, and I will be moderating our event today. I would like to begin by thanking our events coordinator, Becky Parnian, and our AV technician, Chris Cocker, for making this event possible. We have a very exciting book talk today, followed by a conversation between our two special guests and some time left for Q&A with the audience. We have the pleasure of having Professor Kaveh Askari to present his new book, Relaying Cinema in Mid-Century Iran, for about 15 minutes today, and then Professor Golbarg Rekabtalaei will follow with her discussion of the book in a conversation with the author. We will then open the screen to questions from you. You can submit your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I will read the questions as they come and as much as time allows. We're delighted to be hosting Professor Kaveh Askari, an associate professor and director of film studies at the Department of English at Michigan State University, where he teaches courses on history of film after mid-century, classical film and media theory, cinemas of the Middle East and North Africa, Iranian cinema, and recycled cinema. Professor Askari's research focuses on cinema and media history in a global context, and his areas of interest include art cinema, media circulation, and cinemas of the Middle East. His book, Making Movies into Art Picture Craft from the Magic Lantern to Early Hollywood, was published by British Film Institute in 2014. He is also the co-editor of Performing New Media 1890 to 1915, published by John Levy, also in 2014. In addition, he has co-edited special issues of Film History, the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture, and Early Popular Visual Culture. Today, we're discussing Professor Askari's new book, Relaying Cinema in Mid-Century Iran, Material Cultures in Transit, published by the University of California Press in 2022. Here's the book again. It is beautiful in content and in form. We also have the pleasure of having Professor Golbarg Rekabtalaei with us as our discussant. Professor Rekabtalaei is a cultural historian of modern Iran and the Middle East at large. Her research focuses on the relationship between cultural production, modernity, cosmopolitanism, urbanization, nationalism, and revolutions. She is particularly interested in the role of cinema in facilitating cosmopolitan imaginations and hybrid subjectivities in early 20th century Iran. Her book, Iranian Cosmopolitanism, A Cinematic History, was published in Cambridge University Press's Global Middle East book series in 2019. Professor Rekabtalaei has also published on cinema and education in modern Iran and the alter cinema of pre-revolutionary Iran. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of History at Seton Hall University, where she also serves as the co-director of the Middle Eastern Studies program. Professor Rekabtalaei teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on the history of the Middle East, as well as World History 1 and 2. A very warm welcome to both of our guests. Professor Askari, the screen is yours.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks to everyone at the center for your work in organizing this, and to the two of you for taking time, making time in your busy schedules to have this specific conversation. I will go ahead and share my screen and start with a little bit of introduction to the book, and the idea being that, the idea being that I will tease just a few elements from the book, and we can sort of open it up to sort of larger discussions of themes and points in the argument as we in the more informal part of the discussion. So I am currently sharing my screen, and I just hope if you have trouble seeing it, just let me know through some form of messaging. So the book, I mean, I could say just very broadly that it is a cultural history of cinema in Iran, but one that takes a particular kind of approach. It centers elements that are often left out of other cultural histories. So go back here. We look at the circulation of cinema in the book, and all of the sort of elements of circulation as part of that creative labor. So all of the business transactions, the licensing structures, the creative re-editing, and the engineering labor that makes it possible to move films and film technologies through elaborate networks of exchange. One of the phrases that I use in the book, and I repeat a couple of times, is that it explores how cinema's cultural translation is shaped by the conditions of its physical translation, that is, the physical movement of objects. The book focuses on the period of the 1950s and early 1960s, which was a period of robust growth of film culture in Iran. It spans back into the silent era and ahead into the early 70s, but this sort of central period is the main period of focus. And that's because this period is supplied by heavy import culture. There are most of the films, and particularly in terms of box office revenues, are imported films. And yet, despite this robust film culture, the original producers of these films are not able to surveil and capture this film culture in their balance sheets at the distribution centers. And so I want to kind of think about the creative possibilities in this network, in which one point in the network cannot adequately see the other components of the network, sort of what is possible. And you know, Iran is a standout case, but it's an exploration of method that I think applies in a number of different cases. The work is archivally grounded cinema history, the goal of which is to see and understand a cinema network that was, to some degree, designed to not be seen or fully understood, right? That it's about this network of exchange is about obstructions and invisibilities, and everyone at every stage in the process is creating a film culture around that idea. So in other words, I'm redrawing diagrams that were deliberately cut up and dispersed. I'm redrawing those diagrams. And so the question is how to engage with archival objects in a way that opens up connections that were concealed at the time of their actual implementation. So I thought it might be interesting to just use 3 objects. Like I thought I could, you know, there's a number of ways to tease this project, but I framed it. I was originally going to do 5, but I think this works for the time frame that we have. A serialization, a fictionalization of a serial film, a fragment of a film print, and an LP, a commercial release of an LP circulation. So object number 1, a novelized version of an adventure serial film from the 1910s. The film is called The Tiger's Trail. The French version of the story by Guy de Terramont is called Le Tigre Sacré, and it is distributed alongside of this film. So I have here the original release dates. The film was produced by Pathé Company, which is a French parent company in the US. It has its premiere in Los Angeles in 1919, Paris later that year, and then almost 10 years later, almost a decade later, we could say, the film is circulated from Paris around the world, and it comes on screens in Tehran. And I wanted to highlight particularly the serialized story version of the film, because it speaks to the synchrony and asynchrony. Sorry, I said serial, and Siri on my phone decided to wake up. So let me just move that over there. It speaks to the asynchrony of these films as they're playing in Iran. So you have the advertisement for the film screening, a particular episode of the serial, linked in Etalat with the translation of the Terramont story, that these translation originally written in French. And you can start to rebuild an archive of how these films that have been traveling for the better part of 10 years, better part of a decade, and have been worn out and transformed in their travels. Certain reels, certain episodes are missing in particular stages in this physical translation. And the idea for me, the question for me was how to sort of reconstruct the physicality of that. You have all these heavy reels moving around. And what I did is sort of started mapping the discrepancies between the story translations and the advertisements for the film, and discovered that particular episodes here, 5, 6, 9, and 11, there were many episodes of this serial designed to synchronize viewers to come back every week, were missing in their advertisement for the film, but they were there in the story version. And so that suggests that these are probable missing reels from the exhibition context. And so this chapter 1, is an initial, and it's the first thing that I started more than a decade ago, an initial attempt to use various sources, archival sources, to recreate the physicality of these films and film technologies as they moved around the world and in this sort of decade of intermediary time. So object number 2 is from the second chapter of the book, is a fragment of film. This is Hitchcock's North by Northwest, the famous film I'm sure most of you know. And it is a print of this film that I had the privilege of examining at the National Film Archive of Iran. So this is a print of North by Northwest dubbed into Persian, and it can give you a sense, I think, of the way we can trace material provenance of a film through the clues that are left on the celluloid itself. So if you look at the little dot between S and A in safety at the top of the frame, you can see that little dot there. That's a code that indicates this celluloid was manufactured in Rochester, New York, not in London or one of the other manufacturing centers for this safety film. And it was printed as well. If you look at the edge codes toward the bottom, you can see that it was actually printed in the United States as well. So we know from these codes that this is a print that is manufactured and printed. It's a positive print, an exhibition print, not a negative, that is designed and had a life in exhibition in the US, and then made its way to Iran, at which point its soundtrack was pulled off of the optical stripe. And then that optical stripe was covered with this magnetic sound stripe that you can see at the bottom of the frame. And then the dubbed soundtrack was re-recorded onto that. And this has a number of important advantages for just in terms of cost, right? It's incredibly cost prohibitive to try and take apart all the elements of a soundtrack, remix them, and then reprint the film. Here you could take a high quality print, record a high quality soundtrack. Magnetic track has an enormously high quality dimension to it, and Iranian exhibitors and engineers pioneered really these experiments in magnetic track, and then reassemble this and present it for a much wider audience. So there's an obstruction of access, and then there's a kind of engineering innovation and performance that makes it suddenly available to a much wider audience. So that is this idea of amplification in sequence, or relay, which is one of the central metaphors of the book. I just wanted to show you some of the early experiments of magnetic track in the 1940s, as well as the magnetic head for reading this sound on the Steenbeck at the archive. It was such an advanced process that even the heads of the studios in Hollywood noticed the quality of these dubbed soundtracks, the technological quality of them. And at one point, David O. Selznick, the famous producer, wanted to use to set up in Iran a dubbing center, regional dubbing center for the entire Middle East. And that was scrapped for a number of reasons, but I think it's really important to think about a technology in which engineers are working with limited resources and access to materials, and they managed to devise a system that turns the heads of major studio heads in Hollywood. Okay, so the third object is not the film Gone with the Wind per se, but the commercial release of the LP of the score composed by Max Steiner. This is part of a history of producers of films, of film companies trying to promote their films intermediately. So to release a soundtrack that has its own life and is released around the same time as the film. The soundtrack could be listened to in the home. It played over the radio and helped to promote the film, and it generated its own fans around particular composers. And Max Steiner was famous for advocating for the composed score as the only proper score. He really didn't like the compilation score where you pick and choose pieces of music and assemble them together in a film. Little did he know that this attempt to release this LP and to develop his own sort of name and authorship status as a composer enabled an elaborate system of compilation scoring, and in Iran very prominently. So what I'm going to do is just play, this is the third chapter is all about collage scores, musical scores and music editors in Iran in the 50s and early 60s. We have this Gone with the Wind score released in 1952, which is more than a decade after the original release of the film. It's obviously a famous dub, and many of us know it. Maybe less known is the amount of times this score, particularly the main theme from the film, Tara's theme, is reproduced in films made in Iran. So I'm just going to show you a couple of those, and notice at each moment the film comes to how it has this film score has a certain personality, and it comes to mark a moment of sentimental transformation. Not so much in this first clip, but in the other two, very much so. So the score wells up at a moment of sentimental transformation to announce, this is cinema, this is Tara's theme, a theme that is very familiar to audiences from a variety of sources, from these films as well as from Gone with the Wind itself.
میدونی بشر همیشه عادت کرده خوشبختی رو جای دیگه‌ای غیر از اون جایی که واقعا هست. چرا دنبال این میگردی که ببینی کی تو رو دوست داره دکتر جان؟ بیشتر به قلب خودت نگاه کن، ببین تو کیو دوست داری. خوشبختی تو قلب خود آدمه، اونا نباید در قلب دیگران جاست. باشه دختر جان.
Okay, so I will stop sharing my screen there, and I think that's a good place to sort of tease some of the elements from the book, foreground some of the objects in this materially focused history, and I look forward to having conversation and answering any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Kaveh. That was fascinating. I will now ask Golbarg to present her commentary and your conversation together.
Hi, everyone. First, let me just take this opportunity to thank everyone for their work in organizing this panel, especially everyone at Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran, Dr. Behruz Qamari Tabrizi, Dr. Sheyda Dayani, Becky Parnian, and also Christian Cocker. It is an honor for me to have this opportunity to talk about Kaveh's book, Kaveh, thank you so much for providing us with such a creative object-based or material history of cinema. This is really what makes your book unique. Of course, the study of cinema in Iran is relatively new. You can argue that it is still in its infant stage in comparison to some other world cinemas. So rather than focusing on the material history of films, a lot of times what we see is scholarship on form and content of films and their relationship to history, which of course still make important contributions to this developing field. Majority of the academic literature on cinema in Iran focuses on the films of post-revolutionary era and their relationship to politics and religion, or on pre-revolutionary new wave films and their relationship to politics and the 1979 revolution. So there are very few projects that actually take mid-century cinema to be the focus of a study. And that in itself makes your project very important in this field. But it's not only that. Your book really stands out from the extant scholarship in that it meticulously traces the movement and circulation of cinema objects during this period, mid-century. In my own experience, I have not seen a single academic book on cinema in Iran that really does that. So again, that makes your project unique and significant in the field of Iranian cinema and media, and also global cinema and media. But while this book is a material history or an object-based history of mid-century cinema in Iran, I think it goes beyond that. And I will get to that in a couple of minutes. So just please bear with me for now. On the outset, this book is really on the history of global circulation of recycled cinema and film material through formal and informal channels. Majority of time, actually informal channels. But it's also about so many other things. On a larger scale, it is about the global experience of modernity. For example, you talk about how different cuts of same films were screened in different continents and cities, providing a global experience of modernity. The book is also about the local experience of modernity, in how films and film material were bought, cut, remade, and repurposed in Middle Eastern cinemas and studios. In other words, it's about film markets and channels of film distribution. It's about recutting and reshaping of moving images in local contexts. The book is also about reels of celluloid, film scores, promotional materials, such as posters, and audiovisual technology. And interestingly, especially to me, it's also about how regional relationships and negotiations impacted film experience in that they limited or expanded access to films and film material. And in the end, it's also about the creative possibilities of cinema in Iran. It is really rich in that way. And you do all of that by focusing on objects of cinema like celluloid and imaging machines, and by concentrating on this material culture of cinema circulated through informal channels, you are able to reveal global exchanges and connections that have been usually overlooked. You deliver a history that has been omitted or left out in the field. Highlighting relay points of distribution or channels that take objects from relay points and redistribute them, you recreate a network of global distribution that many don't know about, just because it is so difficult to capture and follow these distribution networks. In fact, I think at one point in your book, you do mention that the archives of Hollywood exporters go dark after certain cities because they don't necessarily have that much information about what happens to films after certain relay points. And that really is a task that only a media historian like yourself could undertake. But then this also begs the question, is this book really about Iran? And I know in your introduction, you actually mentioned that it is not. By virtue of sidestepping an exclusively Iranian cinema, in order to examine mid-century global circulation of recycled cinema, You reveal a different history. You expose unnoticed and unexplored aspects of cinema. And in my opinion, one of the most important contributions of your book is that it attends to some of these significant but unexplored areas of mid-century cinema. For example, in the first chapter, you attend to a study of junk prints, secondhand and worn out prints that were usually seen as waste and garbage. But you give junk prints life by tracing their afterlives. Like you mentioned, you use junk print as a term of admiration and not dismissal. In the second chapter of your book, you attend to cinema's creative labor. The chapter shows us that instead of assuming Hollywood's direct institutional presence in places such as Iran, we should in fact look for and appreciate the care and labor that went into the maintenance and repair of films and film imaging machines that made screenings possible. One particular person that really deserves attention here is Mohsen Badi, an engineer and craftsman of cinema, whom you do talk about in your book. You also pay attention to the labor, technologies, and processes designed for the purpose of translation of prints screened in Iran, again, with so much respect and love for the labor that went into translation and dubbing. In the third chapter, you draw attention to the intellectual labor that went into film practices that is not immediately visible. In creating film music collages from multiple genres and countries especially, you mentioned how this became an assembly of found material. But interestingly, it's not the original material that gains currency in your work, but the constructed collage, the end result, the creative labor that is usually overlooked. You show how Hollywood music scores recycled in Iranian films in a way worked to make the industry contemporaneous with its global counterparts, or providing a global experience of vernacular modernism, especially since some of these films were a lot of times screened at the same time as the Hollywood films, or the films in Hollywood. In chapter 4, which is focused on Khachikian's thriller films, you move past the charges of imitation that were, and to this day are, directed at mid-century filmmakers to explore vernacular modernism. Rather than taking Iranian imitation of Hollywood films at face value, you focus on the unexplored creative labor that went into the dandyish recombination of Hollywood and global film elements in these mid-century films. And in addition to all of that, your work studies and incorporates some unexplored archives that really need to be integrated into studies of cinema in Iran as a global or transnational phenomenon. This then just takes me back to the argument I was trying to make, that this book goes beyond an object-based history of mid-century cinema in Iran. Your book is really a book about remembering, in my opinion, remembering creative and intellectual labor that made mid-century film screenings possible and potentially paved the way for the new wave films that are made in Iran afterwards, the films that have gained so much attention, especially in the last couple of years. Your work is a scholarship of care for cinema, its material objects, its creative labor, its engineers, love for music and sound, etc. And your love and respect for the industry really radiates through this book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I really recommend it to any scholar, student, or any lover of global cinema and media objects. So if you don't mind now, I would like to ask you a few questions so we can get a better idea about how this project was made possible. Maybe as my first question, you can tell us a little bit about how did you first come about writing this book? Maybe tell us a little bit about what prompted you to start the project and to develop it the way you have. Why mid-century cinema in particular? And why do you stop at mid-century? cinema in Iran?
Great. Yeah, that's a great place to start. I mean, well, I could talk about sort of the professional origins. There's also a personal dimension. I think I was raised on a lot of these films, the Hollywood films, but particularly with a frame of how these Hollywood films were playing in Iran in the 50s and 60s. But the sort of professional, the origins of the project in terms of the work, I had come out of grad school. I started a postdoc at UC Berkeley, and I was working on my first book on early cinema. And as you noted, the early cinema methodologies are an important component of this work as well, even though this isn't a book on early cinema except for the very first chapter. I was so procrastinating writing my first book by starting to research something new, a new project, something that I actually wanted to work on in grad school. And at Berkeley, they have all these bound hard copy issues of Etelat, and I spent a lot of time in special collections there and started going through this. And that interest in tracing the serial, and a lot of my colleagues at the time were exploring, as you said, the serial as a figure for global modernity, right? The serial as a form, an early form in long storytelling in cinema, a way over multiple episodes to synchronize audiences, to create this kind of, this modern seriality of spectatorship, and to explore themes of modernity as well. The serial queen, action star, this feminist themes that run throughout that work, the interest in train chases and car chases, and sort of these other elements of modern action cinema were incubated in this form. And thinking about it in a global context is something that a lot of us in early cinema studies were doing at the time. And it was in looking at these advertisements in Etelat that I started to think about the asynchronies that are involved in this circulation, and what happens with this massive delay of a decade from initial production until these screenings in Iran, and was surprised to find all of these exciting and innovative ways in which the modernity of that long circulation was foregrounded in the advertisements rather than concealed. And so that kind of became the seed of the project with that serial chapter. And then I just chose, to answer your question more directly, to focus on mid-century because that is a period of massive expansion of particularly film spectatorship, but also the local industry in Iran. And it is a period of expansion combined with a continuation of this idea that the network still doesn't have a significant number of agents in Tehran overseeing the circulation and exhibition of these prints. And therefore there's a much larger degree of creative freedom, even though we're filling tens of thousands of seats in any given weekend or important day. So that period, once you get into the late 60s and 70s, there's a much larger oversight of these companies that are exporting prints to Iran. But in that early period, there's an explosion of interest combined with a lack of visibility, and that was particularly interesting to me.
I really enjoyed this section on how junk prints shaped film culture in Iran in the earlier phases and also in the mid-century. So I thought that was really, really fascinating. So maybe you can also speak to us a little bit about this concept of relay that you use in your book. It becomes central to your project as you draw attention to the ways in which objects transit from one point to another through a multi-layered sequence of networks. So can you speak to this concept that really sets the stage for the chapters in your book, and maybe tell us why you chose this concept of relay, which also appears as the title of your book, and why it's a useful concept to think about when we're thinking about circulation of cinematic objects or media objects in general.
Yeah, thank you. I think this term, and I have one of our mentors who's mentored many of us in the field to thank for pushing me to come up with a a term that is sort of clear language and that is evocative as a metaphor. Relay is, I tried out a bunch of different terms as I was workshopping this material over the past many years. And relay is one that I kind of stuck on because it's a metaphor that works in a few different registers, right? You relay information to a friend or a coworker when you haven't seen them for a while. You relay the events that happened when you were away. So it has this kind of this relationship to conversation. In electronic communication, which is the main use of the term in the modern world, it signifies a point in a network, a relay point, at which a signal comes in and then is amplified, right, and sent out in a new pattern across a new horizon. And so it's that combination for me of being dependent on a signal that comes from outside, but also being semi-autonomous in the retransmission of that signal. And in the retransmission of the signal changes, right? And so something about that electronic communications metaphor was appropriate to think about these films that are sort of moving and that are being re-edited and reshaped and remarketed in different ways at each stage, at each node in this complicated network. And then the final metaphor is one of, well, now it's usually referred to in sport, like you run a relay race, like a relay marathon. It originally was a term that was used to describe a hunt where different animals would be used at different stages of the hunt, so that when they were tired, they could, go to the back and not carry the burden of the hunt with them. But the idea, especially a long relay race, right? You hand off the baton and you have no idea what's happening at the other end of the race. And it is a race that you're at once part of, but it's also a race that you are, because of the structure of this particular race, you're not entirely aware of and present in every particular moment. So that idea of a network, of a path of exchange marked by very deliberate obstructions was another metaphor that I think was sort of compelling to use to frame this phenomenon, to sort of describe it and name it, and then be able to explore it and do work on it in the chapters.
Just a follow-up question on that. So do you think it would also be a useful term, especially keeping in mind what you said about my last question, that some of these ideas, especially about Young Prince, can't necessarily be used for the cinema that emerges in Iran afterwards, or films that are distributed in Iran afterwards. Do you think relay would also be a good concept or theory for scholars of cinema in Iran to use when they're discussing films that emerge after this period, or is it one that is particular to mid-century cinema?
That's an excellent question, and it gets to the core of a kind of balancing act that I was trying to do in the book, and important question of periodization in one's historiography. I want to kind of answer. I want to sort of have my cake and eat it too with that question, right? So on one level, I do want to delimit a period as a concentration of that phenomenon, and that it's important to explore that phenomenon within the boundaries of that period. And once offices are set, once Warner Brothers has an office set up in Tehran, right, the situation fundamentally changes. However, you can still follow really important aspects of that invisibility or that sort of structured, deliberate obstruction, even in these later periods. And I'm sure many of us have examples of this, but even in the book, I end with an example of William Wyler in the coda to the book at the Tehran International Film Festival. We're all the way into the early 70s at that point. You have this major director coming as a guest of the festival, all this publicity. So to some degree, that would be the prime example of maximum transparency, right? You have the director himself there doing this retrospective of his films and overseeing every aspect of it. And you would imagine that this sort of informality, the circulation of drunk prints would go away. And in fact, Wyler had trouble getting, and I went to the archives. The Wyler archives are at the Herrick Library in Beverly Hills. And I went and looked through his correspondence with everyone in Iran when he was preparing for to come to the festival. It was his second trip to Iran. He couldn't get in LA his copy of Roman Holiday that he wanted to show. And so he had to eventually go without the print and have the print not sent. And then he learned once he arrived in Iran that there was a collector, a famous collector that many of us are familiar with his work, and he had this junk print of Roman Holiday that was supposedly destroyed. And he met with Weiler and said, "Hey, if you want to show the film, you can. It's here. It's in my my storage collection." And they did. And so there is an example of a super high profile, high transparency event in which these elements of this informal relay of prints is still prominent. And that's just one example, but my point is that you can carry it into later decades, and I think it's fruitful to do so. It's just important to know what has changed in that period and what hasn't.
Thank you for that. I think the next question I want to ask has to do with methodology. Anyone who's worked on cinema in Iran, especially in the pre-revolutionary period, especially mid-century cinema in Iran, knows about the difficulties and challenges associated with archives, finding the films, finding complete copies of these films. So you, in your book, specifically talk about some of the challenges that are associated with writing books, such as the one that you wrote, especially in terms of access to materials. So can you tell us a little bit about how you went about recreating this network of relay or nodal points, what kind of sources you looked at to reconstruct the circulation of Hollywood films in the Middle East and in Iran, and maybe you can also tell us a little bit about archives, because like I mentioned, some of the archives that you looked at are the kind of archives I think most historians of cinema in Iran don't necessarily look at, and they should. I mean, we should be looking at those and incorporating it, integrating them into our work. So maybe you can also tell us a little bit about your methodology and the archives that really made this project possible.
Thanks so much for that question. I mean, I guess at its core, the book is a comparative archival project, right? It's about going to archives and looking, not necessarily finding one collection and having that. I mean, a lot of important books are written around a particular collection, and that's it has its own sort of challenges and its own advantages to sort of be located in a particular archive, and to kind of think of that in its totality and frame the archive and think about what are the limitations of that collection, that kind of thing. But if you're looking particularly for these absences, right, these moments of obstruction, it really can benefit a project to compare to disconnected sources of information. So you have these, for example, one of the main sources that I looked at for a few of the chapters in the book is business records, the legal documents and studio archives, their contracts they signed with foreign exhibitors and the distribution of their films around the world. And you can see how much they're charging, right? That's an important aspect of the material history. What are they charging for the prints? Why are they only charging $700 to send a print with no expectation of return, right? And that gets you into thinking about, well, it actually costs money to maintain and store print in the vaults. And so there is an advantage to offloading the risk and maintenance costs of this material, even if you're not completely aware of the profits that might be generated from that print in its later iterations. So the business documents, those elements are key. The comparative element of the project, I'm always looking for moments where one actor, one person that I'm following has reached a dead end, and believes the print to be completely gone and destroyed. And then I go and look at the exhibition records in film magazines published in Iran and say, well, okay, well, that print was actually screening on screens at this date and this date. And what does that mean for this distributor to not be aware of that, and then these screenings happening, and how are those things synchronized, or how are they kind of moving together, and where are the films going? Another thing, just in terms of what is absent, right? Things that are absent are the serial films from the 1910s that played in Iran, right? We can't see them. We can't see how they're re-edited. So how do you reconstruct that? Another thing that is absent is the collections of musical scores for the raw material that was used in creating these collage scores. As far as I know, there's no collection of that. If anybody listening to this knows of a collection, please let me know. But in the meantime, we can recreate like the famous music editor Ruby Mansouri. Like he had this massive collection of records. He'd travel around the world and collect these records and bring them with himself to different studios. But we can listen to the films that he did the music editing for and recreate his archive there, and think about, build a database of what are the fragments of films that he's using, when is he using them, and why. So in some way you can kind of recreate that object, that archive, just by doing audio recognition software, which is what I use to track. I mean, some of them I could hear, but also the audio recognition software was able to recognize a number of fragments of scores that I would have no ability with my limited musical knowledge to record. So those are just a couple of examples. And maybe one more is, if you're looking for letters for exhibitors, from Iran, actual writing of exhibitors in Iran, one of the best places to look is in the archives in Austin, Texas, because they were the ones writing to David O. Selznick's company and saying, we want this print, this print, this print. So, so even writing that was produced in Iran is located in Austin, Texas. So those are a bunch of examples. Sorry, I like to give a lot of anecdotes, but I think we should probably transition to the Q&A at this point.
Yes, thank you, Kaveh, for that. Thank you, Golbarg, for your thought-provoking commentary and questions. We can return to them after we go through the audience's question, if there is more time. We actually have a question, Kaveh, that says, thank you for your insightful and engaging talk. In your research, did you find any relationship between Iranian cinema and mid-century modern artists in Iran? Perhaps, for example, what came to be known as Saqlakhane movement in modern Iranian art?
That's an excellent question. No direct connection between those films, and particularly I'm looking at popular films. I'm looking at genre films. I think if we're talking about the growth of kind of modernist filmmaking practices starting in the mid-60s and into the 1970s, it would be a different story. But what I can say that I think is interesting, I mean, this doesn't relate absolutely directly to Saqlakhane, but there is this really interesting engagement with the sort of global itinerary of mid-century modern design, in particularly like the graphic design and the title design of these films. And for example, I start the book as an example with a discussion of the graphic titles for Zarbat, Khochikian's film, and talk about the title designer and his work, not only on the graphics for the film, but also for the marquee. He designed the marquee for the premiere, and that picture is in circulation for the premiere of Zarbat. And there are a number of poster designers who went to like conferences and at the International Design Conference in Aspen and engaged with these traditions of mid-century modern design, and then sort of bring them into the design scheme of even films with a relatively low budget. So there is this kind of a very compelling circulation of mid-century modern design. As far as its connection to modernist movements, that would take a little bit of extra work, but it's a good lead, I think.
Great, thank you very much. The second question, I'm wondering if Kaveh could tie his talk to Hamid Nafisi's claim that during the industrializing years of Iranian cinema, montage culture shaped the method of filmic production. is the relationship between seriality and montage terms that speak to a general paradigm of global modernity, or do seriality and montage have a specific history in Iran? Is Iran a montage? Is there a montage culture that is specifically Iranian?
Thank you for that poetic question. It's great. And full disclosure, he was the mentor that helped me to press me to come up with the term that eventually became this term relay. Yeah, I mean, I think this question of montage culture is really important in, I mean, I guess the way that I approach it is that I try to expand the definition as widely as possible. So we're looking at like collage in soundtracks and scores, but I'm fascinated with this sort of the creative body of work that is amassed by a particular music editor. But I'm also fascinated by the ways in which that montage culture or that remix culture operates in an everyday level. So I think in a lot of these examples, for me, the most exciting point is the point at which, and I was trained to I had many seminars in graduate school dealing with questions and theories of montage and practitioners of them, and trained to really sort of admire this tradition throughout cinema history. And for me, the most exciting points are the points at which that kind of canonical component of cinema history, the sort of foundation and theories of montage, disperses into these forms of everyday practice that I want to define as creative labor and highlight as forms of creative labor in their own right. And I think that's part of Nafisi's point as well. That this is, if you look at these films, they are in many ways compilation films, even the fiction films. They have this one film noir mode, and then they go into family melodrama, and then they go into, it's this kind of segmentation and juxtaposition that is at the heart of the creative impulse for making those films. And the same could be applied to engineers, to the dubbing artists, to the sound designers, to all of the below the line labor.
Okay, Kaveh, if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask a question, and depending on time, I can ask you more questions. I have a lot of questions, but much of your book actually deals with these transnational exchanges with American cinemas, especially we're talking about Hollywood films. I was wondering if you could tell us how your research goes beyond these Western influences to also examine regional influences or regional relay of styles, film styles. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this. And again, if we have time, I have one final question that I would like to ask.
Excellent, yeah, and I want to. That's a great question for me to articulate a kind of caveat here with this work. And the one thing I wanted to be very careful not to do is to in any way suggest that this is some kind of definitive history or a comprehensive history. And in fact, that my method itself seeks to avoid totality, and the idea of definitiveness implies complete transparency. And this is a book about gaps in transparency, right? And so the idea for me was to explore sort of one avenue, one sort of important part of this network of exchange, without suggesting that is more important than others. And if you look at the kinds of absences, if you're talking about like Hindi cinema and its circulation in Iran, those absences are also repeated in a lot of the film magazines, particularly the ones that had aspirations to attract intellectuals to write for their criticism. That is a direction that some of my new projects are going, and I have this edited collection that I just did with our colleague Samhita Shunya about sort of circulation around South Asia and the Middle East. It's called South by Southwest Asia, and looking for those kinds of regional connections. The book itself underrepresents those and is very clear about its own absences in doing so. But my hope is that some of these methods are transportable as well. And so in developing some of these methods, I think they can very much be applied to other nodes in the network, definitely.
Kaveh, I also have a question for you. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to the viewer's experience, to the spectator's experience, and their interaction with mid-century Iranian cinema and viewing these imported soundtracks, objects, even scenes. And so if you could please comment a bit on whether or not this experience and this interaction changed the transmission of these physical objects and the expansion of the industry at large.
That's also an excellent question, and this issue of reception and how to track it is a perennial question for cinema historians, media historians. That I tended to focus in the book on the technological, on the physicality of the films, but always with an emphasis on how those technological innovations and transformations could play for particular audiences. So for example, the idea of these recycled scores in films made in Iran, these compilation scores, the practice was very common to have the film soundtrack playing outside of the movie theater as well as inside of the movie theater and attracting audiences. And there are a couple moments in the chapter on the sound where I sort of imagine a kind of auditorship, if not spectatorship, that was made possible by particular uses of sound in those films. And there, if you go through the films listening to them for the possibilities of interaction with an audience who's only listening to it versus the possibilities of interaction with an audience who's listening to it and seeing the images at the same time, a different interpretive horizon opens itself up. And a number of these films, I can imagine if you're used to hearing, and these soundtracks played outside of record stores as well. So if you're used to hearing the soundtrack played outside of a record store, and then you go and hear the same soundtrack played outside of a cinema, there is a sense in which this collage score is contributing to a very specific kind of overall soundscape in the space of the city.
Great, thank you very much. We have just about a minute for a final question that's been posed by the audience. If you could please keep it under 1 p.m., that would be great. The question is, given the tremendous amount of censorship during the Pahlavi period that you're studying, were there any, I believe it's political, it's not intelligible, the word, were there any political direct or indirect films? Where does Farrokhzad's film, The House is Black, fit in your studies? Finally, any feminist films?
Yeah, so I don't know if I can answer all the components of that question before 1 o'clock, but yes, absolutely. I mean, I could say that's a continual point of discussion. The place to look for sort of political oversight and potential censorship is probably the magazines. There's kind of long discussion of that, and even the turnover of particular editors. Editors had a vision for, like, Sitare Cinema, like, had a series of editors and conflicts, and their editorial board reflects some of those. As I said in the outset, I am definitely interested in these sort of elements of modernist filmmaking. It's not something that I could explore in the context of this particular book. The modernist filmmakers, the art filmmakers, avant-garde filmmakers deserve several of their own books, and I wouldn't do it justice to try and incorporate that into that. But I will say that the interest in this itinerary of modern design, as I said before, does speak to a kind of circulation of modernism. So if you take a broader modernist approach, there are elements of what's going on in this book that can connect to those. And I have an answer to the feminist question, but we're right at 1 o'clock, so maybe I should just stop there.
Thank you very much. I'm sure anyone who has any further questions can email you about them. I'd like to thank you both for taking part in this exciting event. I'd like to thank all the audience members who stayed with us and asked questions. See you later.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
And feel free to reach out to me if anyone has any other questions.